Tenakoto, Tenakoto, Tenatato Kator. My name is Brian Lucid. I lead Napai Mahotonga, the Wellington School of Design. It is my great pleasure to serve as host and organizer for the Motyf Festival 2021 and 2022. Motyf is an international symposium and media art exhibition that explores current and future forms of interactive and motion typography expressed through art, design, space, and technology. Founded by Professors Eva Sataleka, Anja Stoffler, and Ralph Dringenberg in 2013, Motyf has a particular focus on initiating discussion between academics and industry practitioners about interactive and dynamic media text design and delivery. With each festival, Motyf has grown, adding new schools and academics to the community and expanding into broader and more diverse design topics. Several years ago, we began the planning for a Motyf symposium to be hosted in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2021. Then, a global pandemic came, borders closed, and we were challenged several times to pivot and change our plans. What was once slated to be an in-person event hosted at Massey University in Wellington, New Zealand, has become a series of online events, workshops, and an international exhibition. I want to thank everyone in the Motyf community for their patience and their resilience. This year, Motyf has brought together designers, academics, and students from the United States, Europe, and the Pacific. Together, we have explored how the elements and principles of visual, motion, and interactive design can be leveraged within sequential, interactive, spatial, or experiential works to authentically inform our understanding of society, elucidate complex concepts, or aid in the communication of data. This live stream will feature 5 recorded talks that explore how designers work with and for audiences to make complex knowledge more accessible so that others can make informed decisions about the significant challenges we face as a society. The designers speaking do this work across data visualization, data storytelling, location-based experiences, and government policy and services. As you will see, their projects seek to empower others and to have impact across education, health, social justice, and climate change. Our talks begin with Angela Morelli of Info Design Lab, a socially conscious design firm located in Oslo, Norway. Here, she describes a participatory process of designing visual narratives that make complex knowledge more accessible by capturing the imagination of the audience.
Hello, everybody. I am incredibly happy to be with you today to share a small piece of my world, visualizing data for impact, a participatory journey from data to storytelling. The word participatory will take us into the space of the co-design process, which is such an important dimension if we want to design visual narratives that capture the imagination of an audience while deconstructing complexity and facilitating understanding. I would like to start by giving you a little bit of context and telling you a little bit about myself, about the company we run, and about why we do what we do and why impact is a central part of that. Info Design Lab is a small company, and it is a socially conscious information design firm. We help companies and organizations turn complex data into meaningful narratives, unique visualizations, and compelling messages. We are based in Oslo, though you might guess I have a rather Italian accent. We work with scientists and activists, with the public and the private sector, with universities and the media. We teach a lot and run courses. And most of the time, the goal of our projects is to co-design visualizations that make complex knowledge more accessible to other audiences, empowering specialists and non-specialists to make informed decisions about the big challenges we face as a society, from education to health, from social justice to climate change. These are some of the projects we have worked on: the visualization of the Norwegian environmental targets and the design of a platform to navigate through those targets; informed health choices, that started as a 5-year partnership funded by the Norwegian Research Council, where leading scientists from Uganda, Norway, UK, US, Spain, Italy, Rwanda, Kenya created resources to teach kids how to spot fake information and to assess the reliability of the health claims, which led to authoring 2 research articles in the Lancet. The Interactive Evidence to Decision Framework, which is a system designed to help groups of people use evidence in a structured and transparent way to inform decisions in the context of health recommendations. A project with the Norwegian Center for Climate Change Research, consisting in the co-design of 4 data stories and data visualizations targeting policymakers, the media, medical practitioners, and citizens to support informed decisions around the health risk connected with increasing temperatures and heat waves due to climate change combined with air pollution. The design of a timeline that explains the history of the 1.5 degrees target, showing that the rise to fame of that target is built on years of careful groundwork by people who share a profound precariousness to the adverse effects of climate change. And at times, we have been working on projects that put us on a very steep learning curve. An example is working with people who cannot afford to fail, activists around the world who live in danger for their lives, suppressed by regimes or fight for climate justice. When working on extreme projects like these ones, the learning points become very evident, and a lot of the noise in the work we do is taken out from the equation, and you're left with the essence of what really matters. And another extreme collaboration with a steep learning curve is the collaboration with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations body that assessed the science related to climate change. And in the last 4 years, we have been responsible for the visualizations of the summaries for policymakers of 3 reports. The report on global warming of 1.5 degrees approved in 2018, the report on climate change and land, which was approved in 2019, and the physical science basis, which is the working group 1 contribution to the AR6 cycle approved in summer in August 2021. Now, the IPCC reports are for the world's policymakers. They are drafted by scientists over many months or years. They are big books, and the special reports consist of the full report, the big book, a technical summary, and a summary for policymakers. So the summary for policymakers is basically where the interface between science and policy happens. They can be 30, 40 pages long. And the focus of our work has been on the visualizations of the summaries for policymakers. And being the information designers responsible for the visualizations of the summaries for policymakers of these 3 reports has been a defining journey for us professionally. Because the scale, the complexity, the rigor, and the magnitude of these projects have been pretty unique. So now we often get asked, how do you do what you do? As information designers, our goal is to communicate useful and meaningful information to our readers. And we do that by leaning on our experience, on research, on collaboration, and on our toolkit. These are some of the building blocks we use when we work on any project or when we teach in universities or in research organizations. This toolkit keeps expanding. And in the past years, we have started bringing our clients on learning journeys, namely collaborations where we guide the clients through all the stages of the design process while they work on their own real projects step by step. So this toolkit becomes their toolkit as well. The tools we use range from colors to typography, from static images to interactive solutions, but the most important tool is the co-design process. We co-design with our audience, and most importantly, we co-design with the scientists and the content experts. When about 15 years ago, I started diving into climate science, and I understood the urgency of environmental issues and the importance of critical thinking, I decided that I would knock on the door of research organizations advocating for a new way of visualizing data in a design-driven way, in a human-centered way. Most of the time, nobody would answer my call, but very few times they would. And those who have answered have been pioneers in contributing to a changing design culture that goes from a way of working that is order and delivery to a way of working that is design-driven. What do I mean by design-driven? If there is one rule or metric that is increasingly important for us, is participation. Especially when we design information for decision-making or for high-level negotiations. There are so many different actors involved in the design process, so many scientists or experts from different disciplines, and so many users with different needs, that orchestrating that participation is one of the most important things of all. And that's why a lot of our work does not happen behind a computer screen, not anymore. It consists of mastering the data, interviewing stakeholders to understand their needs, collaborating with other designers, developers, and cognitive scientists. So we borrow tools from systems design, service design, cognitive science, and we bring them into the information design and data visualization space. The goal is to empower audiences to see patterns and to move from data to knowledge and action. And if we had to use a diagram to visualize the journey from data to action, we could say that on one side, we have the audience, and reaching the mind of our audience is for us the most important thing of all. Learning how the audience will use and receive the information and understanding the context in which the information will be processed is key if we want to reach our user's mind. On the other side, we have the authors of the data and the scientists. Listening to their needs and ideas is equally important. As designers, we need to dive into the content with the guidance of the content experts, and we need to build a deep and shared understanding of the nature of the data and the science that underpins it. Now, these two actors are the most important players if our goal is to turn data into information, presenting it in a way that becomes knowledge in the mind of the users and hopefully help make important decisions and ultimately inspire change. And now the process from data to change that on the diagram looks so neat, in reality looks more like this. It is not linear, tidy, and neat at all for different reasons. First, because of the collaborative and iterative nature of the design process that involves different users, scientists, designers, stakeholders. And because it is not a plug and play process, we have to adapt to the challenges and projects that we deal with. Second, because cognition is complex. Information is mediated by the human brain. It's not the message that goes into the brain, but the interpretation of that message and how it is encoded. Third, because science tells us that as human beings, we assess how the information we receive is going to affect our lives, our contexts, our values, and the links to the social groups we belong to. When information threatens those values, we struggle accepting the information even if there is scientific evidence behind it. Fourth, because even if the information is communicated properly, even if we understand it, even if we make the right decisions, we might not be able to act because there are barriers out there that prevent us from doing so. And as designers, we need to be aware of those barriers. Now, in the transition from information to knowledge, storytelling plays a crucial part because it is often what helps us create compelling presentations, experiences, and interactions. Data visualization and information design can be seen as a way of crafting distinct, memorable, and transformative moments in time. If our goal is impact, and by impact, I mean reaching the mind of our audience, if the goal is to move our audience from understanding to action and change, we should not be just designing for what we want people to do with the information we communicate, but also for what we want people to feel. Well-designed experiences change your audience in some way, a shift in feelings, beliefs, or actions. We can think about it as transformation. The question is, how can we create a time-bounded experience that changes someone in some way? And the first answer is that it's exceptionally hard to inspire change in someone when you don't know anything about them. Transformation requires a shift in someone's internal state. You cannot tell your audience what to feel. You cannot order someone, feel excited now. We have to create the conditions that lead to that emotional shift. And to do that, we have to know who they are and what they care about. Too often, we start by focusing on the activities we want to happen during our experience. This might sound extreme, but here's the switch I'm inviting you to make. Start with the feelings you want to inspire, and start with the people you are designing for, and design with them. So I would like to share a little bit more of what it means to co-design in projects that involve hundreds of people. And the collaboration with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and IPCC is one of those collaborations. The seed and the beginning of our collaboration with the IPCC lies in this iconic photograph taken in December 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted by 196 state parties with the goal of limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. So in that occasion, the IPCC was invited to provide a special report to make sure governments around the world could understand the difference between a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees Celsius. And the report is a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And after 3 years, on the 8th October 2018, at 3:40 p.m. in Incheon, South Korea, the IPCC chair gaveled to a close the approval session of the summary for policymakers of that report. And the key message of that report is, yes, we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees, but political will is key. And every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, every choice matters. Now, the IPCC reports are incredible undertakings, considering that hundreds of authors from many countries are involved in the assessment and writing of the reports. And in the latest report, for example, that was approved in 2021 in summer, the physical science basis, 234 authors from 65 countries in total were involved. They reviewed a massive body of scientific work. The report has 14,000 cited references to the scientific literature. The expectation for these reports are really high. For the AR6 report, there were over 435,500 posts on social media and over 38,800 media articles online and print just in the first 2 days following the launch. And more than 2 million was the number of articles shares, and 3.3 million is the estimated number of people who shared or got engaged with the content. Now, if you open the cover of these executive summaries, you will see the drafting authors of each report, the scientists, who are the real heroes. But you will also see our names among them, which is still unbelievable for us. My question is, what on earth are two information designers doing in the list of drafting authors of the most important climate reports of the 21st century? I don't think we have all the answers. We are constantly looking for those ourselves. But what we do know is that information design can shape content. Information design is content. And it has the power to turn information into knowledge, action, and change. When Anna Pirani, the head of the IPCC Technical Support Unit of the Working Group 1, approached us in 2016, it was clear that they wanted to pay more and more attention to the way they were using visualizations in their summaries for policymakers. So we agreed that we would try to co-design in the most inclusive and human-centered way. And one of the results was that the visualizations became milestones to be reviewed and approved in the same way text would be. The challenge for us was very high, considering that the way the IPCC process works is incredibly complex and rigorous. And here's when some extremes enter the picture, because one IPCC iteration for the drafting process of the report looks like this. Lead author meetings, and the work is done remotely until authors submit drafts of the report. The drafts are sent out for review in a very open process because anybody can comment on the review drafts. And then comments are sent out to the coordinating lead authors and the team. Now, this is one iteration of the IPCC process. For the special reports that we have worked on, there were 3 or 4 of those iterations. And at the very end, you have an approval session where delegations from 150 countries and more, scientists, IPCC chairs, they gather together for the final approval. The review order drafts can be seen as massive user testing sessions where both text and the visualizations are reviewed by hundreds of experts worldwide. It is a process that is highly participatory. Now, what do you think happens when you send out the drafts with the visualizations? You get feedback, right? Now, if you've ever conducted user testing or included users for feedback in your projects, you know what user testing feels like. It's just like a mix of empowerment and vulnerability. Now, in this last report, the AR6, the physical science basis, across 3 drafts, 78,007 review comments have been received from experts and from countries with different needs and perspectives. And the comments have to be addressed one by one. And some hundreds of those were only for the visualizations. For the AR6 report, we had 3 iterations in the design process. So the first one after the expert and government review of the second order draft, a second iteration after the final government review of the final order draft, and then a 3rd iteration during the approval. And these iterations are in sync with the drafting timeline. We spend a lot of time mastering the content and planning user inclusions. The red dots here is where we plan for in-depth conversations to check the needs of the policymakers, follow-up conversations for quick reality checks, for example, during design iterations, user testing to measure if the visualizations fulfill the intent of the visuals, review comments on the visualizations, and contact groups during the approval. But this is just me scratching the surface. So maybe you start grasping the magnitude of the experience for us. And after the drafting process, there is this final approval session for the 1.5 report, which was the first report we worked on. The hundreds of delegates from 196 countries gathered in Incheon, South Korea. And the approval is called word by word approval, because actually every word, comma, every figure, every visualization is up for a final approval process. Since we had been going through literally fire and ice for months leading up to the approval, we thought that we were in for a really interesting trip, almost like a conference to observe some negotiations on the highest level in a beautiful city. And we could not be more wrong, because the word approval doesn't really capture what actually happens at these meetings. It makes it sound relaxed and easygoing, but in reality, the work of the scientists is put under microscope, including the visualizations we co-designed with them. And of course, there are country politics and national interests at play, but the scientists are there to make sure that any changes to the figures or text do not undermine, misinterpret, or in any way compromise the science. And the adrenaline level is really high. It's like entering the eye of a storm together with all the scientists and the IPCC team. We have to design live during the approval, sometimes with political negotiators breathing down your neck. These delegates are some of the world's most skilled delegates. Rest and sleep are not an option. And this year, for the first time in the history of the IPCC, the approval was organized remotely. It lasted 2 weeks of almost non-stop work. And the scientists were real heroes. So we entered our very first approval without having any idea of how things could be. But we entered the approval with a rock-solid knowledge of the content and the data, of the risks and the caveats, of the uncertainties and the challenges. And not having that solid knowledge would have been devastating for the visualization process. The visualizations had to be approved word by word, millimeter by millimeter. And the huge benefit of the continuous collaboration kicked in on so many aspects, enabling us to understand the challenges, suggesting the most appropriate solution, being very firm at times, enabling the scientists to own the visualizations, and allowing also the delegates to see these visualizations as a result of their own work because of the co-creation process in the review rounds. And one of the most important things that I've learned in the past 20 years is that clear, inclusive, and powerful communications are a consequence of good design, but most of all, of brave leadership. Because it is easy to agree that we need more clarity, that we need to communicate data in a more powerful way, but it is often hard to accept that in order to get there, we have to do things in a different way. We have to disrupt our own systems. We have to embrace uncertainty and convince others to do the same. We have to go through the design process without shortcuts, accepting that the solutions we need might not be innovative unless we trust the process. And if you ask me, leadership within the research organizations involved is the most important aspect if we want to collectively accept and follow a co-design process that every stakeholder involved can trust, creating a shared vision. Working with the IPCC has been one of those journeys where you witness a change in culture over an entire organization when it comes to design data, from a traditional order and delivery way of working to a traditional, to a design-driven way of working, where the involvement of users and hundreds of stakeholders is key along the journey. Now, these changes cannot happen in a day, but they are possible. So we see the co-design process as a place where there is maximum space for sharing, for conversations, for feedback. And in this process, data visualization becomes a very powerful tool, not only for the sake of the very final result, but because any visualization puts things under a spotlight. And the unsolved challenges literally stick you in the eye until they get solved through all the discussions and prioritizations that have to be facilitated among hundreds of people. And most of the time they can get solved in a clear and beautiful way. To manage this complexity, we have to create specific tools to record the history of everything we work on, to keep everybody in the loop, to ensure everybody's on top of the development from the very beginning to the end. And in order to do that, we build what we call the slide books. We basically record the history of each figure, of each visualizations, using slide presentations shared with authors and with everybody involved in the process. These presentations are in continuous progress until approval. It is almost like working in track changes for the visualizations. Now, we would never claim that the visualizations you see in these summaries for policymakers are, visually speaking, the best they could be. Because given free rein, we would have designed things differently, but it's not about us. The policymakers are the audience, and it's hard to imagine how any data visualization could be more tailored to an audience's needs in this process. Every single one of the world's policymakers gave their stamp of approval to these visuals. Each one of the visualizations represent a lasting tool, not a one-time impression. So I would like to wrap up this talk with a memory. In 2013, I was queuing with my family near the entrance to the Warner Brothers Harry Potter Studios in London. And this quote was standing in large letters on one of the walls. No story lives unless someone wants to listen. So it's not just enough to produce data visualizations if they do not meet our audience where they are, whoever the audience is supposed to be, broad audience for a media outlet, patients for a doctor, policymakers for the IPCC, and so on. Whatever the format, whether static or interactive, printed or digital, we have to make sure that we are meeting our audience where they are. Otherwise, we are basically wasting time and resources. And in order to achieve that, we need to co-design with users and content experts. We need to embrace our audience and their needs from the start to make sure that we build engaging and understandable narratives that the audience wants to listen to. Thank you very much.
Jan Kubasiewicz is Professor of Communication Design at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design and a collaborator to every Motyf symposium so far. His talk explores the academic foundations of how we communicate. he explores how ideas travel from person to person, growing, changing, and evolving as they move from host to host.
We tend to forget that human communication, the core of humanity, is an artificial process. Willem Flusser wrote, "It relies on artistic techniques, on conventions, on tools and instruments, that is, on symbols ordered into codes." And after learning codes of communication and the particular symbols that make them, we tend to forget that this is an acquired knowledge. It becomes our second nature. So I would like to begin with two questions. The first, at the micro scale, is how do I teleport an idea originated in my brain into the brain of another person? And the second, at the macro scale, how do ideas, styles, and trends travel from person to person, spreading virally sometimes? These questions point to a bizarre way human communication is intertwined with biological evolution, Darwinism. At the core of universal Darwinism is the concept of replicators. Genes make exact copies of themselves, most of the time. And as a result of that genetic replication, the natural selection can function. This is often described as the gene machine or the survival machine. But genes are not the only replicators. There are also memes, the second replicators. Richard Dawkins coined the term meme in his seminal book titled The Selfish Gene. He describes memes as the units of cultural transmission. These units, ideas, artifacts, melodies, behaviors, gestures, travel from person to person by copying, by replicating. The memes, like viruses, can never exist on their own. They need a host, the person, the user, to replicate. That's why the memes need to appeal to users. Because the user is supposed to copy, refine, and modify them. And finally, the users decide to share through potentially endless mimetic life cycle. Dawkins wrote that human brains are the computers through which memes operate. This is a brilliant observation, considering that The Selfish Gene was published in 1976. That is the age of pre-personal computer, pre-internet, and pre-social media. The term meme is derived from Greek language, and it means imitating thing as a noun, and to imitate as a verb. The terms imitation as well as simulation bring to focus the relationship of reality and its representation. Imitation and simulation are not synonymous, of course, yet they are intertwined as they both relate to memes and human communication. To imitate is to copy. to follow a model. To simulate is to create a model. So to imitate might suggest a lack of creativity. But this is not the point here. The point is that imitation is the process or the method of creating memes. But when the user modify the meme's message by adding their own interpretation, they create a new mutation, a new model to follow. And creating models is the method of simulation. So, what's the objective of simulation? It is to imitate some aspect of reality as close to that reality as possible. As close as possible. But it is always the artificial reality that is the product of simulation. I use the expression artificial reality to avoid pointing to a specific technique or technology. There is a peculiar space between reality and artificial reality, or between non-fiction and fiction. It's a spectrum, or continuum, if you will, allowing various degrees of speculation within or between various domains. For instance, the continuum spanning the distance between science and science fiction, science fiction and design fiction, design fiction and design. We spoke already about artificiality of human communication. So let's risk this question. Is language a simulation? Does language create an artificial reality? And the short answer is yes. Let's start with speech. What is speech? The complicated movement of the vocal cords, tongue, and lips that causes the air vibration that compiles phonemes into words of a system of symbols called the spoken language. Articulated spoken language was a threshold, the first singularity. Crossing that threshold elevated humanity to another level. But what is important here is that language is the grassroots phenomenon. Language is the original wiki. Steven Pinker is the owner of that expression, the original wiki. Indeed, thousands and millions of people using language every day create the idioms, the figures of speech, the linguistic metaphors. And these are the original means put into circulation by copying and modifications. Does the word come from speaking, or speaking comes from the word? We will not be rendering the verdict on that today. However, somewhere, somehow, before the word is pronounced, it has been already formed, and it belongs to a bigger system, the narrative. So the true innovation of orality is the mysterious and magical concept of narrative. The narrative is the art of time, or the art of representing and manipulating time. The Aristotle's beginning, middle, and end is just the beginning of narratology as the primordial communication model. But assuming that the language made memes possible, was the language and the narrative a primordial simulation? Or perhaps we should pull the camera even further back and focus on consciousness and our perception of reality first. Donald Hoffman, a cognitive scientist, in his theory of multimodal user interface, proposes a concept that conscious experiences of space and time, colors and smells, for example, might not resemble or approximate anything in the objective reality. Hoffman uses a metaphor of GUI, the computer graphical user interface, to explain his hypotheses. The icons on the computer screen do not resemble what they represent, nor they have any causal powers. Instead, they drastically simplify what they represent, and they, on purpose, hide the true complex web of causal sequences occurring within the computer system. And for a good reason, for ease of use. Similarly, according to Hoffman, our conscious multisensory experiences do not represent reality, but give us only an access to the icons of multimodal interface to reality. And the perception of these icons, like the icons of the computer interface, are effective precisely because they simplify, or perhaps better expression would be to dumb down what they represent, not to give us detailed insights of objective reality, but to facilitate useful actions. If we consider that, what kind of simulation an interface is? Does Hoffman's theory suggest that only our own consciousness is real? Yet, there are many simulations that exist in our reality because our collective consciousness agrees that they are real. Collective consciousness agreeing what is real. Isn't this kind of simulation dangerous? But since there is a scientific paradigm of simulation, so we must be safe, right? Indeed, simulation is considered the third paradigm of science. Paradigms of science are another example of non-hierarchical continuum, mapping scientific methodologies in some way related to history of science. The first paradigm of science is experiment. To be exact, an empirical evidence, based on which the second paradigm of science functions. The second paradigm of science is theory, that is formed to explain why things happen the way they happen. Theory, of course, must be supported by empirical evidence. The third paradigm of science is simulation. Powered by computational science, simulation is a method of conceptual modeling and prototyping of artificial realities to prove or disprove scientific theories. Human cortex, not only the cortex of the scientist, has the ability to simulate, to model the world in order to solve new problems and learn new behaviors and invent new tools. early tools of the Stone Age began a long history of tools to extend our physical strength. Then came tools to extend the range of our senses. Then came tools to shape and modify nature to better serve us. We are all grateful for antibiotics and vaccines. The purpose of the fourth category of tools is to, I quote, extend or support our mental powers, to find and classify information, to formulate and articulate ideas, to share knowledge, to expand the capacity of our memory, unquote. These tools, Nicholas Carr calls intellectual technologies. The intellectual technologies have the ability to create models and simulations in order to learn new behaviors. Text is an example of such technology. Text is also an example of complex behavior, one of the behaviors that require cortex. Homo sapiens began using pictures for communications about 40,000 years ago. But only about 5,000 years ago, the symbolic visual representation of spoken language marked one of the most important turning points in human civilization, the invention of writing, that is, linear text. Textual information led to literacy and the awareness of a linear sense of time. Humanism was a result of individuals plowing through texts in search of truth, of self-determination, in search of ideas to make our lives worth living. The artificiality of text as communication code, similarly to spoken language, which we discussed before, becomes transparent to those who use it. And those who use text, almost everybody, use text to create fictitious or non-fictitious simulations. Religion creates cultural myths disseminated by sacred books as models and simulations of behaviors to follow. Philosophy texts challenge our sense of reality by models and simulations of cognitive processes of acquiring knowledge. Psychology explores simulations that our mind creates in order to understand who we are. Byproduct of linear text is the first big schism of humanity: orality versus literacy. Orality and literacy, so brilliantly discussed in Walter Ong's seminal work. Text and textuality articulate specific way of thinking. Marianne Wolf, in her book Reader, Come Home, considers that acquisition of literacy as one of the most important genetic achievements of Homo sapiens, since human beings were never born to read. Reading is an acquired cognitive ability that exists only because of text. Writing is the mother of all media, wrote Friedrich Kittler. Indeed, everything seems to be mediated by text. Text becomes the universal interface, augmenting all other media. Even interface design today seems to return to text from icons and animated buttons. Virtual reality And augmented reality is currently exploring new concepts and conventions of integrating text with simulated three-dimensionality. It brings us to another big schism of humanity, literati versus digerati. Literati are born from what they created, the paradigm of text. In the world of literati, the most ubiquitous object is a book. Millions of volumes mark the story of literati. From scrolls of ancient libraries of Alexandria and Rome to codices, large and small, manuscripts and printed books in limited and mass quantities. They are proudly collected and stored in huge national libraries, as well as small libraries of local schools and communities. Books are real-world objects, but they create the world of make-believe, the simulations. One of those spectacular and self-referential simulations is a short story titled The Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer. That story speculates on the model of the ultimate library, the repository of all texts that have been and will have been written. The librarian do not know the whole structure of how to navigate this immense library of Babel, but they know that it contains all statistical combinations of characters in all known scripts that form all combinations of words and sentences and paragraphs in all languages, and that is all completed oeuvre of literati universe, the existing and future text. Digerati took on the Library of Babel project and built what we know today as Internet. It started modestly, as all new technologies, by copying and converting previous forms of text into digital formats. But soon, of course, the Internet revealed its own new possibilities, driven by algorithms. We have a new kind of memes now. The memes of Internet are not the same as the memes described by Richard Dawkins. Susan Blackmore calls them techno-memes or tremes, the third replicators. They carry the same characteristics. They are copied and modified and shared, but within the technological environment, the Internet, the online platforms to be exact. And that makes it different. Indeed, there is a quantitative and qualitative difference between original memes generated by language combinations vis-à-vis ones operating on digital platforms by algorithms. The techno-memes are forcing our brains to become more like meme machines. That's the title of Susan Blackmore's book. Following the algorithms, we believe that we are in control. But the platforms are making us do things. That's the new quality that comes from the quantity of the actions we are supposed to take, which become big data trending, which we're supposed to follow, the endless mimetic life cycle on steroids. For the pre-internet generation, literacy was synonymous with the ability to question sources. Today, meaning of literacy is to produce one's own content, one's own simulations of reality. Hopefully, hitting the jackpot of viral distribution as technomemes. The technomemes not only contributed to, but perpetuated the new default of narcissistic behavior, the selfie cult, the meme politics, the crisis of participatory culture, and perhaps the crisis of democracy itself. Proliferation of technomemes is the evidence of internet platforms failing us. Internet failed the promise to be transformational factor in the society. The promise of understanding the complexity and diversity of the world, culture, history, economy, and science. Internet is the library of Babel that has gone crazy. Now, Gujarati are building another alternative world, metaverse, and promise to elevate simulation to another level. So the objective of simulation is to imitate some aspect of reality. I'm repeating myself. But it is always the artificial reality that is the product of simulation. To see truth or to see alternative truth. To agree or disagree with the voting results. To see or not to see the war. Who owns the language of simulation dictates how we are supposed to understand the world. So, choose your simulation carefully. Your decision will determine in which parallel artificial reality you will end up living. Good luck, and thank you.
Paul Tobin is a senior staff member of Weta Workshop, a world-respected concept design studio in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Weta does visionary work across the film, television, and game industries. Today, Paul will speak about his ideation process for powerful, educational, location-based museum experiences.
Hi there, my name's Paul Tobin. I'm a senior creative at Weta Workshop, which is a company based in Wellington, New Zealand, and we primarily specialise in concept design and manufacture for the creative industries, particularly film, television, video games, and more recently location-based experiences in exhibition design. So we're probably most well known globally for our work on Lord of the Rings, the movie franchise with Peter Jackson. But obviously we've come a long way since then. So today's talk, it's going to be done at pace because there's a lot to get through and I've only got about 25 minutes. Obviously it's exploring ideas around communicating complexity and how you might go about that. And I guess I'm going to talk through a live example, some work product that we did on a project, an exhibition called Gallipoli, The Scale of Our War. And I'm going to need to give you guys a little bit of context on the exhibition before I dive into the work that was done on it. It was done in conjunction with the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa, and effectively it combines the world of museums with the world-class creative artistry of Weta Workshop to immerse you in an 8-month Gallipoli campaign. Now Gallipoli is based in Turkey, and it was a defining military campaign for New Zealand and our involvement in World War I. We lost over nearly 3,000 lives, which for a very small country was a hugely impacting event, which changed the course of our country really. So it was a very important exhibition to be involved with and a real honour to work on. So by the numbers, we've had over 2.5 million visitors to Gallipoli. It's probably been the most successful exhibition at the Museum of New Zealand. We've had over 1 million poppies left by visitors to the exhibition with personal messages. Just to give you an idea of the labour, is 24,000 hours of labour to build and install the 8 large figures, which we're going to talk about. It's an interesting statistic. 22% of the visitors are under 25 years old, and that's quite significant because it was one of the key objectives of the exhibition was how do we get a younger generation to engage with arguably a battle that took place in 1914, I believe, well over 100 years ago. This is just some shots of the inside of the installation, just to give you an idea of the kind of work we did. And the overall layout was you come in through the entrance, and the idea with the concept is that you effectively are being led through quite a railroaded experience where you get these narrative moments based on diary entries from soldiers. And these are very curated experiences that are all about emotional engagement before you move into an annex that explains more of the technical information. And you work your way through the experience, which tells the story of the 8-month campaign. That's in a very sort of quick snapshot. And obviously the pivotal sort of concept for the show was the building and designing of these huge figures, which I believe are 2.4 life size, highly realistic figures. They're the most realistic large scale work we've ever done, and we've done a lot of large scale work over the years, particularly for film. So this just gives you an idea of the scale and realism of the figures and the impact that they hopefully have on an audience. So let's talk about ideation. Ideation is the creative process of generating, developing, and communicating new ideas. In the design studio at Weta, this typically involves brainstorming, sketching, concept designs, fabrication of models, prototyping, graphic design, and pitch presentations. It's kind of whatever it takes to get the job done. But this talk is more about the ideation process. It's not about the full body of work we did on this project, but it's more about the work that I did in collaboration with my boss, Richard Taylor, and another art director, Ben Hawker, to build a concept for this show in a very, very short period of time. So effectively, I got called into a meeting with my boss, Richard, and Ben. It was a 2-hour briefing. Richard had a few ideas, but nothing solid. He had one particular drawing, which was a giant figure, but giant soldier with a very small group of people next to it, showing scale. And I kind of realised that I sort of thought that was actually not just one moment in an exhibition, that actually could be the concept for the whole exhibition. I then had 5 days to put together a presentation to convince Richard, the head of the museum, and I think Peter Jackson was involved at that stage, that this was the right approach. So what I'm going to be showing you is the presentation, a very slightly cut back version of the presentation that I actually used for the pitch, and I'm going to kind of deconstruct it and show my work process around how I communicate complexity through a presentation. As an ideator, I consider myself to be a problem solver, an innovator, and a creative opportunist. It's not just about solving problems. It's about supercharging an opportunity. Once you understand the problem, you try to supercharge it with creative opportunity in an innovative way. This is the most complicated slide in the whole presentation. Maybe screenshot it. This is effectively me trying to put everything that I'm going to talk about on one slide, just to get it out of the way. But effectively, the process we're going to be looking at in a nutshell is identifying the problem and opportunity, looking at research, and in other words, kind of going to the source of the challenge, the problem and opportunity, finding out as much as you can about that, and building a case for your proposed solutions. and presenting those solutions in a way that gets people emotionally engaged, and then transmitting that information through layered engagement, looking at sort of pragmatic and emotional responses to that information, and finally how you might implement your solution and show a clear and credible plan for the solution. Right, I'm going to move on. Okay, so on the right-hand side we have the presentation that I gave, and on the left-hand side I'm obviously indicating which part of the process this slide is talking to, and I'm going to spend less time probably talking about the slide and more about what I'm trying to achieve with the slide, and I'm just going to rip through this. So this was the and just a heads up, this presentation was a little bit awkward. I had to do it, it's got quite a bit of text in it. Normally I would do a verbal pitch, but because this was being sent on to a couple of other people after the verbal pitch, it had to kind of be one of those presentations that had to work on itself without me explaining it. So it's kind of a bit of a weird presentation. It's got to have enough text in it that it can be understandable without me explaining it, but at the same time I was required to explain it. So there you go. It's just one of those slightly tricky presentations. Okay, so this is the client brief, which was effectively the head of Te Papa wanted us to come up with a concept that explored emotional history. And so Te Papa's opportunity and challenge was to change the hearts, minds and lives of people visiting the exhibition. So this is very much Te Papa's mission statement for this project and the opportunity. What Te Papa was wanting from us was to effectively get the content to feel alive. How can this content be meaningful to a generation which never experienced the Great War, and arguably any of the survivors from that historical moment have since passed away. So at this stage we're in that identifying area. We're trying to identify the opportunity, the creative opportunity and the problem. And also where I'm trying to get information from the client around what they're wanting. And so this is me kind of, I guess, repitching back to the client what they've already told us, but just to clarify that I understand what they're asking for. This is me identifying the problem. History is dead. For history to have relevance and meaning, you need to breathe life into it. And this, again, is something that Te Papa was very much aware of, and that's the whole point of why we were discussing this idea of how can we make history a living idea. Part of my process is to ask lots of questions. If I get access to a client, I ask an insane number of questions if I think I can get away with it. Obviously, you've got to be a little careful around how much time you take with the client, especially if they're busy. But if I can't get access to the client, I start asking questions based around different viewpoints. I'll ask questions as a designer myself working at the workshop. I'll then imagine myself as someone going through the exhibition. I'll imagine myself as the person I'm pitching to, and I'll ask questions. And the whole point of this is to drive some level of thought process around gathering information. If I need to find information, I need to start asking questions, because then I need to find those answers. Obviously, in this case, a primary solution, which Te Papa was even talking about right from the get-go, was memory. It's organic, it's alive, it's a living part of a society, and the ways in which people remember wars and commemorate is definitely an important aspect of the commemorative culture around war and war memorials. So obviously that was a very clear course of direction in terms of where we were going to start to look for solutions. For me, the only real important question was, why is Gallipoli relevant to me as an individual, to future generations, and to New Zealand? It's got to be made relevant, because without relevancy, you lose engagement. And so for me, this is what the client needs, is they need us to answer this question for them and deliver something that makes this whole Gallipoli campaign relevant. So firstly, it's a little bit of a trip down, it's kind of context is a big part of the starting point for research. So that involved doing some research around dawn services, not just New Zealand ones, but also the other Anzac dawn services. I was probably the only person in the company that had actually been to Gallipoli in Turkey and actually experienced a dawn service at Gallipoli. And so I had a very strong personal connection to I guess the sharing of that experience and how we might be able to achieve that. And so again, for me, this is thinking of myself a little bit like a lawyer. I'm trying to build my case, and a part of that is setting up the context and looking at the origin story for what in New Zealand is quite a unique experience based around the dawn service and its origins. Still in the research phase here. Now we're talking about relevance. And again, because of my experiences at Gallipoli for the dawn service, it's basically an event that's heavily populated by young New Zealand and Australian travellers. So this is in some ways part of the target market. This proves that at least for a number of young people in New Zealand, this is a relevant and meaningful historical experience. So how do we take that experience in Turkey and bring it to New Zealand? And that's part of the challenge. And primarily, we wanted to sort of look at taking a kind of like a Saving Private Ryan approach. One of the challenges, I've been in literally hundreds of museums, and most of them are collections of artifacts with fairly dry academic information detailing those artifacts. And it's not true of all museums and not true of all exhibitions, but I think in all fairness, it's true of a lot. And that is a kind of a recipe for disaster, in my opinion, for emotional engagement, because really what you're looking at there is a very, very small percentage of an audience that is going to engage with that level of detail. So how do we tackle that challenge of that information is very important. It's not to devalue it in any way, but it's only going to become relevant if we can get people to engage with it. And so what I'm going to step through now is kind of the concept we came up with to get people to engage with this information in a way that's going to become relevant. The main way we thought about doing it was looking at turning, like in filmmaking, you have characters, you have actors, and we engage through the story through those actors, becoming emotionally attached to those actors. So what we did is we effectively cast our soldiers. We had a bunch of amazing diary entries from real soldiers at Gallipoli, and what we chose to do was to try to reenact in a kind of slightly cinematic way and in a very dramatic scale way those moments. And that's how we get people hooked on an emotional statement, and then we unpack towards them. So, as I said, the big challenge was demystifying the high volume of academic knowledge. Obviously, Te Papa had some incredibly talented staff that were, massive experts in their field. They had so much information and so much sort of content. And so the problem was, in some ways, was convincing them that they had to let go of some of that content, that filling a space full with stuff is not necessarily the best way for people to engage with it. And so one of our biggest sort of challenges was convincing them, Te Papa, that they needed to free up a significant amount of space to put these giants, we called them, into, and to let the space breathe and to let people experience it without a tremendous amount of information. So one of the things I tried working out early on was how to get my head around the core concepts of the show, and coming up with a simple, symbol, which is relevant, given the lives lost, that could help communicate some of those key concepts. And also the thematic pillars of the show, which is really important, because obviously when we're building something like this, if we have to take something out of the show, the only way we can usually decide that is if we hold it up against these thematic pillars, and then if it supports those pillars in a strong way, we leave it in. If it doesn't, well, then maybe it needs to come out. And so that's why it's kind of the pillars are a way of helping you make informed decisions around the creative journey that you're going on, and to be very clear around what the experience is for the audience. So this is where I hit them with the big idea, and I just whipped up a quick logo, Gallipoli, the scale of our war. This is what we felt the client needed, something at scale, something that's going to be impacting at scale. And now I'm building my case for why scale is so important. And then I'm looking at the scale of remembrance, which is one of the key things you notice when you go to these war memorials, is that there is just the enormity of scale of the memorials, which is obviously a stand-in for the enormity of sacrifice of the soldiers that fell at those battles. We're looking at characters. Empathy and story through characters is very much how we approach film. So we're wanting to get the audience to engage and empathize with real people rather than artifacts, which is a really key distinction for this exhibition. I'm drawing on the visual vernacular of the graphic design of war and how we report war, particularly the Life magazine. Just the starkness. I mean, obviously, most of our content is in black and white from that period. It's very striking. Black and white plus red is a very striking combination. And I'm trying to work to a simple 1, 2, 3 delivery in terms of the solution. Scale plus characters equals story, scale plus characters plus story equals emotional history. So that's my formula that I'm working to. I'm just reminding the museum that we can pull it off, that we've got a long tradition in building large, sort of spectacular experiences at a high level of detail. Though at the time, this particular project was a huge challenge even for us. We had to do a huge amount of R&D to pull it off. So we're looking at the diary entries and creating them at monumental scale. And then we hit them, this is when I hit the client with the concept, a quick bit of concept design that I worked up. We've got an actor in, we dressed them in fairly authentic World War I uniform, and then obviously with a little bit of Photoshop trickery, I came up with something that I knew would be very confronting for them, and I kind of wanted to shock them a bit, because that was the whole point. I kind of wanted to really get their attention. And so I really pushed the boundaries on this one. This is a particularly confronting image. And obviously at the scale it's at would be very, very confronting. We were also talking about bringing in smell and sound as well, which would have been very challenging to deal with as an audience member. Of course, I then offered up a much more safer option to kind of, show that we could do something not quite so challenging, but to the same concept. And the trick is, when we recreate an emotional moment like this, we then unpack it for its historical relevancy. So we get the emotional connection first, and then we unpack it, and that means like we might want to be talking about the weapons they used, or they might be talking about the moment, that particular battle they were in, but whatever. But the point is, we unpack that moment. And that's where we start to shift some of this content outside of what we call the bell jar areas, which is where this emotional kind of storytelling moment was happening, and shift them to the annex, which is where the kind of more educational information is stored. And that's kind of, so here we go. This is kind of, again, just showing you that this is the annex, is where the educational information is, and obviously these emotional bell jar moments here. Showing a map is really useful. I didn't produce this. I had a much cruder version of this for the first presentation. This is actually the second presentation I did as a follow-up. By that stage, we had a chance to kind of do some better 3D modelling to help define the space. And this was actually used in the final exhibition as a map. But I had a very similar sort of sketch of how this could work. So basically, what we want to do is we want to directly transmit our concept into the audience, and the more successful we are, then the more powerful the message is going to be. So we weren't just talking about building in a very large, realistic soldier at scale, and we wanted to actually have that diary moment be written on the walls visually while you're in that space. And to have a soundscape as well. We commissioned some original soundscape and music. And so we were using all these cinematic tricks, I guess, to get people emotionally engaged. And, some people literally were, tearing up at some of the experiences of going into this space. So in that respect, I think we were very successful. So then the people are kind of primed to potentially want to know more about this individual and as a result through the rest of the context of the campaign. So as I was saying, mainly the main core here was just part of the challenge here was just trying to work out how much information we could put into these spaces without distracting from the core sculpture that we were putting in there. And it was very much a balance as to how little or much we would do. And so how we actually did it is that the space would darken down, and that would be your cue to either enter or leave. And then the lights would slowly come up, and the soundscape would come up, and then you would get the diary being written, and then you would have a narrator speaking the entry as well. And so it was a kind of a very controlled experience. In the annex, this was one of the hardest sort of areas because we were taking up so much space with our giants. It meant the space in the annex was at a premium, and so it was really challenging to work with Te Papa to try to work out what stayed in and what got taken out. And it was challenging. But the key thing is that we had to make sure that the artifacts related back to the emotional connection, and so people were sort of prompted to want to learn more. Typography and graphic design was huge. This was a concept I came up with in terms of it's kind of a classic hierarchy layered engagement approach. But the whole point was that we took the information and we layered it. So that if someone was just breezing through the exhibition, they would still stop and read maybe the top one, which is I was shot in the neck and out of action. So someone just literally walking through couldn't help but see that and the image. If they stopped for maybe a minute or less, they would probably get the secondary amount of information, which is telling more about the character and their role. And then if they stick around even further, we're starting to get down into some of the more like statistics, like how many bullets were fired or what kind of weaponry were used. But so this was this kind of idea that if we can capture people at different layers of engagement, different levels of interest, so that it doesn't just present itself as complicated information that you just look at and want to walk away from. And the typography for was geared around a moment from that diary. And we obviously took a very pictorial approach. We literally tore apart the lettering with a bullet. Or we had soldiers digging trenches in the typography. Again, in an effort to make and create engagement through interest. And through storytelling. We're literally telling stories in words and image in the same block of text. And this is just an example of the, a couple of examples from the annex. We've got 3 images here. And the idea is you follow this red line that leads you through the exhibition. And that line has specific time dates on it as well, which are important. There were secondary displays to create as well, like the uniform breakdowns and stuff like that. So it wasn't just creating these big giant figures. There was a lot of other additional information. When it came to the giants, we sort of slowly stepped up the level of ambition around them so that at the very end you get this multi-character event, sort of like a climax to a film in some ways. We made our process was to take our own workshop staff. This is Ben Hawker and his brother Luke, and doing some photo compositing because we're getting Luke in there twice. But the key thing here was we were trying to, they were actors as well as workshop technicians. So we were trying to explore how we could visualize these moments, these frozen moments in time, and then turn them into these big scale representations. So we did a lot of experiments, fast and furious, with photography and a little bit of concept design. The next step was crucial. We had to get in the experts to ensure that anything that we were doing was 100%, well, as close to 100% accurate as we can. Because it's a museum, it's got to be factually accurate. This is not film. This is not a World War I film where you can take some liberties perhaps. This is all about accuracy. And so really important. We hired actors. In some instances, we were trying to capture a good likeness to the original soldier if we had a photo. But mostly it was about ensuring that we got the right sort of actor to carry that performance. And obviously this is the actors we hired, and shot, in preparation for the reference to actually build them. And just to finish up, that is Richard Taylor, the head of Weta Workshop, who effectively sort of ran the whole job from the Weta Workshop side of things. And just to give you a sense of scale as to that final scene, which is the last, it's actually not the last scene you have in the exhibition. The final scene in the exhibition is actually a soldier on the Western Front, where you lay your poppy as a form of commemoration. But this was certainly the kind of climactic end piece for the exhibition. That's the end of the talk. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully that was at some level illuminating in terms of how we, dealt with a very complicated emotional story, and how we managed to bring it to life through, our design work and fabrication. Thank you very much.
Kelsey G leads the High Impact Innovation Program within New Zealand's Department of Corrections. A designer committed to social change, she will talk about the Kia Project, an initiative currently taking place in New Zealand prisons that she proposed as an undergraduate design student. The project supports meaningful relationships between children and family members who are incarcerated. This talk comes to us in kind collaboration with our colleagues at UX New Zealand.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Koro pehu te maunga e ru nei taku ngākau. Ko Wanganui te awa e mahi nei aku mā harahara. No Wanganui me te Wanganui atara aho. Kei High Impact Innovation Program o e mahi ana, me he lead designer o. Ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei. Ka mihi hoki o ki ngā tohu o te rohi nei. Ko Kelsey G tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Morena, Dulcin, and welcome back. Wow, what an honor it is to be here today amongst so many incredible people doing incredible mahi. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you all for the wairoa, the presence, and the energy that you bring to the space, including those of you joining us from overseas. I'd just like to extend my thanks and gratitude to the UX New Zealand team for keeping us all safe and once again adapting this day into a virtual conference. My name is Kelsey. As you may have picked up, I live here in Wellington, but grew up in the beautiful river city of Wanganui. I'm the lead designer at the High Impact Innovation Program. We're a multidisciplinary justice sector innovation unit based out of Arapotama, Aotearoa, New Zealand's Department of Corrections. We've been around since 2018 and seek to reduce harm, drive efficiencies, deliver meaningful services, and lead the way for long-term justice system reform. You might remember me from my talk at MiniCon last year, where I spoke about how we as designers have the power to help create a fairer and more just society through using our creative thinking for social innovation and social good. I truly believe that our superpower lies in the ability to redesign society, especially for our whānau and our most vulnerable communities. Today, I'm here to continue that conversation and once again explore design's role in creating equal opportunities across safe, seamless, and healing public services. Today, I'm going to walk you through a project that's held a lot of my heart for the past 4 years. It's a project that is ambitiously using design to help reduce and prevent not only cycles of crime, but levels of child poverty and systemic institutionalized racism too. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Mate, you're dreaming. And you're right, she has indeed been a pretty big job. But much like my talk in November, once again, you'll see that our solutions are by no means technically or aesthetically groundbreaking. What's been groundbreaking for us are the learnings that have helped us to walk in these complex problems. We've learned what it means and feels like to create mana-enhancing processes and experiences for all involved. And we're also seeing how more meaningful impacts can be achieved when you hold a holistic and ecosystemic view of all end users at the forefront of your design. In doing these things, we've honed in on a usually disregarded group of people who experience New Zealand's justice system. And as a result, we're contributing to changing life trajectories across generations. Today, I'm going to show you how the High Impact Innovation Program has been harnessing the humble superpower of design to deliver safer, more seamless, and healing public services for children of prisoners across Aotearoa. We're giving our most vulnerable group of children the building blocks of support towards a fairer start at life. Before I properly kick off, I just want to ensure that I'm creating a safe space throughout this talk, as I'm going to be discussing some sensitive topics and experiences. Safety in this space is paramount for me, and I recognise that some things may be hard to hear or quite upsetting. So please, if at any time you feel unsafe, feel free to step out and take a break. The kind and helpful UXNZ staff are also on hand for anyone that feels they need support. If you feel unsafe in any way after my talk, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Sarah Paxton, the awesome UXNZ manager. Myself, along with the High Impact Innovation Program and UX New Zealand, are more than happy to help find the right support for you. So a spotlight has always been on New Zealand's criminal justice sector, but over the past 4 years, this has really been intensified. In March of 2018, the Department of Corrections hit peak capacity with a whopping 11,000 people in our prisons. This not only earned us second place in the developed world for the highest rate of incarceration, but it also triggered a nationwide criminal justice summit, which heard prominent call-outs from our communities for reform and change. This crisis highlighted not just how much our system was causing more harm than healing. It is failing us, not only our offenders, victims, and staff, but it is failing our whānau, our communities, and sadly, our tamariki, our children too. Currently, there are approximately 23,000 children across Aotearoa experiencing separation from a parent who is in prison. These tamariki are often referred to as invisible children, named so because they are our invisible victims of crime in a situation of their own, faced with a sentence they didn't choose. Not only are these children plagued by the prolonged loss of a connection with a loved one, but many of them won't understand why mum or dad have gone away. They may have also been traumatized, witnessing their loved one be arrested, or carry unnecessary feelings of guilt, thinking that everything was their fault. On top of that, the weight of the silent stigma that society places on families of people who are incarcerated can feel condemning on its own. These children are naturally a powder keg of emotions. Without the right support and connection, they are 9.5 times more likely than other Kiwi kids to end up as our future prisoners. And in fact, we are already seeing multiple generations of families in our prisons today. Unfortunately, this problem gets a lot more complex. the effects of colonisation are rife across our criminal justice system. In 2018, when the Department of Corrections hit peak capacity, it was recorded that just over 50% of these people were Māori. That's an absolutely devastating statistic, considering that Māori made up only 14.9% of our total country's population at that time. Continued overrepresentation of Māori in our prisons means that we have continued overrepresentation of Māori in our invisible children. Dishearteningly, as many of us know, Māori children across our country are already severely disadvantaged for many reasons. Our criminal justice system is only exacerbating this. So, how do we try to solve a problem that seems to have all of the odds against us? How might we bring positive visibility, senses of safety, self, and purpose to unheralded, disempowering experiences and spaces that were never designed with consideration for children? How do we ensure that these children feel loved in times and spaces where all love can feel lost? And most importantly, how do we make sure that our solution absolutely works for Māori? Today, I'd like to introduce you to the Kia Project, a tamariki-centred system that aims to empower the 23,000 often forgotten children of prisoners who are impacted by the experiences of a parent's incarceration. This project was originally my 2018 University Honours project through the College of Creative Arts at Massey University. I was lucky enough that it was picked up by the High Impact Innovation Programme, and we've been working to adapt and implement it across the country since. It is one of the first tamariki-centred services that the Department of Corrections has implemented for children of prisoners. Kia is a multi-touchpoint design strategy focused on creating positive interventions during the experience of visiting a parent in prison. Primarily, it seeks to reduce the anxiety that tamariki may feel when visiting a prison, as well as feelings of isolation and grief at home or in their day-to-day life. It does this by creating empowering and meaningful spaces to visit, equipping children with the knowledge of what to expect, and providing tools that enable whānau to nurture and strengthen their bonds together. The Kia Project also recognises the imbalance of Māori in our prison population, and it responds by offering solutions that are designed in partnership with Māori and mana whenua. It places the cultural values and worldview of our Indigenous peoples first. Now, before I get into this, I just want to clarify that I'm by all means not an expert in this space. I'm second generation New Zealand Chinese, and while I've learned a lot from working in this space, I'm constantly on my learning journey. And this is exactly why the concept of the Kia Project was designed to be adapted, and the final implemented solutions designed in partnership with Māori and mana whenua. Together, we build a relationship and work to the principles of kaitiakitanga, manaakitanga, and tāwharo. These principles encompass the Kia Project, and our solutions are driven by the question, how might these principles enhance a person's mana when they're experiencing trauma? The concept of mana, in a very brief definition, means respect, authority, and prestige. Mana is power in action, and power can refer to spiritual power, legal power, social power, as well as manaaki or manaaki, showing respect, generosity, and care. A person's mana can be transferred, shared, diminished, enhanced, and restored. According to Te Hurawai and M. Baker from Te Rau Ora, mana enhancing practice is a way of engaging with others that cares for the spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual dimensions of a person. For the Kia Project, mana enhancing practice is manifested through our three principles, creating the feelings of safety, whānau, and aroha, a sense of trust, a sense of self, and a sense of purpose. The three keys to facilitating empowerment within a person. There are three phases to the design and implementation of the Kia Project. each aiming to enable mana enhancement and meaningful connection at repeated events across an invisible child's experience. We begin by redesigning the spaces that tamariki and whānau interact with during a visit. Our team of designers work collaboratively with the people in our care, who I'll refer to as tāne or men, staff and mana whenua, to collaboratively design a visual story and kaitiaki, a guardian character. These become the journey that children will follow through the prison spaces to the visiting room. This visual story is based on purako, stories or myths, or whakatoki, proverbs and formulaic sayings, that feature our chosen kaitiaki character, making each site's experience different and specific to its local area. Our collaborative design team will spend time lovingly hand-painting these stories into the physical spaces, from the car park to the gatehouse and security, hallways, and finally the visiting hall. This phase also includes replacing harsh prison-style furniture with more comfortable and comforting soft furnishings, such as couches, ottomans, and beanbags. The goal here is to create a space that will manaki, respect and care for those that are in it. It's the notion that visiting mum or dad in prison shouldn't feel like home, but it should feel welcoming and it should feel safe. My original concept paid homage to kia birds as kaitiaki over people travelling through harsh environments. Most of the kaitiaki across the country are also manu, birds. This captures the notion of tawhiro, to provide shelter. It is through our kaitiaki that this project wraps its wings around our tamariki to provide physical and psychological protection and safety. The goal is for our kaitiaki character to become a fictional friend to tamariki, a guardian or a protector, and someone they can always count on to be there during challenging times. Our kaitiaki tie the whole project together from end to end by becoming prevalent across our other touchpoints in both prison and home environments. After the spatial adaptations are complete, we create and distribute kete for tamariki to engage with at home. These kete contain a storybook about our kaitiaki and the journey of visiting mum or dad, an activity book to learn about whānau and whakapapa, stickers to familiarise children with the visual story they will follow, letters and pepeha cards for whanaungatanga, relationship building, and a soft toy version of the kaitiaki for comfort. We've also made our storybook available online as an animated video. This is to be able to reach tamariki beyond the project. I'll share a link to this after my talk. The purpose of these kete is twofold. The first is to lift and enhance the mana of our tamariki. We reduce their anxiety by preparing them for what they can expect to experience when they come to visit. And we reassure them that not only is their loved one safe, but that they, our tamariki, are still loved and cared for too. The second is to lift and enhance the mana of parents and caregivers. This situation is by all means not easy for parents. So let's take a load off and support them in supporting our tamariki. Let's help our parents to communicate these experiences with their tamariki and find ways to open conversation about what's happened in a safe and empowering space. Our final step is implementing games, books, toys, and activities for whānau to do together during a visit. Things that enhance a feeling of family time and allows families to further explore meaningful engagement and connection in their own ways. Here we select a range of things to service multiple age groups and create some of our own resources based on the visual story and kaitiaki character. This phase enables families to simply enjoy being a family together, to nurture and strengthen their bonds free of any significant emotional barriers. Many of the dads in our care often become unsure of how to interact with their children when they come in for visits. Providing age-appropriate materials to help bridge this gap allows parents to learn key parenting skills in a safe and positive space. This final step is so simple, but facilitates the mana enhancement of whānau collectively. tamariki are once again reminded that they are still loved and have the support of their whānau. Parents are supported in maintaining whānau connections and supporting their tamariki. And the people in our care are empowered by a meaningful visit. So you can see the benefit of each of these individual phases, but let's take a look at how this begins to work as an ecosystem. When we start to analyse how these three phases interact together, we can see how this project rolls into a strategic system. The effects of each of the interventions across the system snowball into one another, maximising the impacts and meaningful change. In redesigning the spaces children see, we're able to redesign the framework of the visiting experience itself. We curate the journey that we want tamariki to have, redirecting their focus away from harsh elements like wire fences and concrete walls, protecting them from the harm and trauma that our previous spaces have caused. And providing tamariki with the knowledge of what they can expect to see and creating assurance in that actual experience when they see it, then supporting our parents to help empower their children in their home environments, we can begin to diffuse feelings of isolation, anxiety, and grief. Tamariki begin to feel empowered to visit and emotionally strong in their day-to-day lives. We therefore begin to facilitate a mindset in tamariki that is aspirational and focused on whānau and aroha, a mindset that simply allows kids to be kids before, during, and after visiting. Defusing these emotional barriers opens up the opportunity for families to spend more meaningful time together during a visit, something that is so valuable when that time is already so limited. We hear a lot about how children are major motivators for parents to change, but often parents don't want their children exposed to such a place. In creating safer environments for tamariki and equipping whānau with the right tools, families are able to stay connected. Having meaningful visits becomes a highly contributing factor to not only preventing our tamariki from turning to gangs and crime to find a sense of belonging, but for parents in prison, they also contribute to supporting a shift away from reoffending and provide them with stronger support systems to reintegrate safely back into our communities. Finally, let's come back to our statistic of 50% of our prison population being Māori. If we want to create a fairer and more just Aotearoa, we have to start here. We have to start by evening out the playing field and giving those that are most disadvantaged a fair shot towards better lives. In working collaboratively with Māori parents in prison, mana whenua, and staff, we've been able to ensure that we look at each person's experience holistically and wrap our solutions in feelings of aroha, safety, and whānau. We've found opportunities to further adapt the project based on site needs or the needs of local families, and as such, we continue to lift the mana of all involved by offering an experience that maxes out on empowering, supporting, and manakiing our tamariki. Meaningful visiting experiences that have been designed with Māori and for Māori helps to set our tamariki, our tāne, and our whānau on better trajectories in life. Through our visual stories and activities, families have an opportunity to learn about their whakapapa together, and strength is found collectively through learning about the ao Māori. The journey presented here offers an opportunity for both parent and child to find a sense of belonging in their tūranga waiwai, their place to stand in the world. And through meaningful visits, we can continue to empower them to take this place. Connection to whānau, whenua, land, and whakapapa history is defining for Māori. Returning to, strengthening, and empowering these connections becomes one of many steps in breaking cycles of generational youth offending, reoffending, and poverty. It is through these small building blocks of support that we will begin to see less Māori in our prisons, our state care, and as victims of crime. We will begin to see more people succeeding and contributing to their communities. And we will begin to close the gap between all children of prisoners and other Kiwi kids, giving them opportunities for fair starts in their lives. Kia has been piloting in 3 men's sites, and we're currently in the design phase at 2 women's sites. We've worked alongside some talented people who have managed to find healing and personal growth through our design processes together, and staff have commented on positive behavioural changes of the men back in their units. Last year, I was also informed that a man's time on the Kia project has shifted his perspective and behaviours so significantly that the parole board recognised our project's effects despite not being a formal rehabilitation program. We've also seen staff perspectives shift from power-driven, scare-them-straight attitudes to ones that understand and recognise the benefits of whānau connection and how our spaces must reduce harm for children. Walking in complexity is a challenge, but we don't have to walk alone. You've seen that the processes and methodologies we've used are nothing new to you, and our solutions are by no means aesthetically or technically groundbreaking. Through design, time and time again, we've proven that we can better respond to business issues by listening to our end users. Today, you've seen how we can maximise our impact by taking a holistic and ecosystemic approach. You've also seen how through partnership and collaboration, design has the power to facilitate change across generations, and it bridges the gap in aiding and healing the effects of colonisation. We truly do have the power to reduce harm and redesign society. So today, there's 2 questions I want you to think about going forward in your mahi. If you're working with Māori or any minority group of people, how might you enhance the mana of those you're designing with and for? And how might you design opportunities to give our next generations a fairer start in life? I just want to finish off by sharing an email that was sent in to me by one of the visit staff at a Kia Project site. Kia ora Kelsey. I just wanted to let you know that we handed some of the Kia Project packs out to tamariki that attended visits on the weekend. I've made a register that will sit in the control room to be marked off as we hand them out to each child. The way we decided to distribute the packs was to hand them to tāne before they entered the visits room. We had a quick kōrero with them about what the packs contained and a brief background about Kia Project. What we found was that the interaction between tāne and their tamariki was one that was very positive. The tāne themselves were very grateful to hand the pack over to their tamariki, as under normal circumstances they usually can't give them anything. Every one of them said thank you to us before and after their visits. It was quite a cool feeling for us as staff. The tamariki looked around the room to find the kaitiaki and his mates, and our tāne helped to find them as well. They all started to look through the activity books and made up their own games using the stickers and other things in the pack. There was a little girl who didn't want to speak to her father at all, but as the visit went on, she was smiling, cuddling, and talking to her dad. In the end, she wanted to keep playing and reading books with him. Our tāne was very grateful and went back to his unit in a happier space than he was at the start of his visit. The mother of this little girl rang me today after her visit. She wanted to say thank you for the pack we'd given her daughter. It was a good icebreaker for her and her father, as she didn't want to speak or even look at him as she was scared by what she was experiencing. The mother said that they had read through the book and was so grateful that the story explained what to expect before, during, and after the visit. She said her daughter is feeling much more at ease with the thought of coming to visit her father and is looking forward to completing the activity book with him. They are going to read the book most nights so she can be reminded that she is loved and feel better about coming back to visit. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you all so much for having me today.
Kat Greenbrook leads Rogue Penguin, a studio that combines data storytelling and visualization to communicate with impact. In her talk, she speaks to the foundations of data storytelling and gives us insight into how to communicate accurately and persuasively with data.
Kia ora koutou. Hi everyone. Thank you for checking out this presentation. I'll be stepping you through a bit of an introduction to data storytelling, explaining what it is, and giving you some hopefully easy tips on how you can improve your own work in this fast-growing space. Before we start, my name is Kat Greenbrook. I work as a data storyteller out of Te Whanganui-a-Tara, or Wellington, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This job title is a relatively new one as the data communication space evolves. My work involves a lot of graphic design, sometimes a bit of animation, and more recently, physical visualizations of data. The purpose of what I do is to enable people to better understand some of the really complex data we have and hopefully in turn act on it. To give you an idea of my educational background and how I came to work in this field, we have to go back to high school. In my final years of high school, I studied all the sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, and all the maths, calculus and stats. But I also loved and studied art. When I went to university, I had to choose a field and I picked science. So I graduated with a major in genetics and biochem. What I also discovered though while studying science is that I didn't want to be a scientist. The next logical step for me then was to take on some sort of analytics role in business, and this is a space I've played in for about 10 years, this data science space. But I didn't love my job. I was missing a big creative outlet in the work I was doing, so I went back to study, and this time studied art. This photo was taken with my daughter at my graduation exhibition. I was now armed with both art and STEM degrees, but at the time no one was employing for this. I knew my skill set was unique, but I also knew that what I wanted to do businesses would pay for. So I created my own business, Rogue Penguin, to work the way that I wanted to work. Rogue Penguin now has just turned 5, and during this time I've helped some amazing clients communicate their data insights. Before we get into data storytelling, I'd like to just get you to try and think a little bit differently about data. Sometimes we think of the process of collecting data as very rigid, it's unemotional, impersonal number crunching. But what we need to remember is data is just another lens which we can view our world through. Data represents our lives and the lives of others. I like the Latin origin for the word record. Re means again, and cord means heart. So record means to pass through the heart again. I like to think of this when we're recording data. It's a way to help us remember a very small part of the world around us, and because of this, I think data can be very emotional. It's the job of the data storyteller to help communicate this emotion. So let's first answer, what is data storytelling? It's all about communication. It's about how you take what to some may be too complicated, too boring, or too complex, and make it engaging and easy to access and understand. For me, data storytelling combines 3 fields: data, story, and usually visuals. It's easier to see how they relate if we look at the intersection between each field. So generally, we all understand the intersection between story and visual. If we pick up a kid's book, there's usually a narrative running through it, combined with illustrations to appeal to its target audience. Comic books are also the same. As we move to the right, the intersection between visuals and data represents any way we visualize data. This is usually done using some sort of graph. Moving around to the intersection between story and data, this is sometimes the one people aren't too sure about. When we think of story, we may think of something quite fictional, quite emotional or creative. When we think of data, like how I talked about before, we may think of something quite opposite. So how do we combine them? This intersection is called a data story. All it is a narrative that has been written to include data. There's no visual component yet. A data story is about how we get our messaging right. When we've written the data story, we can add the visuals. And this is data storytelling. The visuals help to tell the data story that we've already written. It's really hard to design visuals if you haven't written your story first. So let's start there. How to write a story. It seems pretty easy, right? Didn't we all get taught this at primary school? Well, you probably did, but unless you practiced it, the chances are your narrative intuition may need a little work. In true science style, I take my story writing lessons from this guy, Randy Olson. He's written a few books. Houston, We Have a Narrative is one of my favorites. He is one of the best science communicators out there, but he didn't always work in this space. He used to work as a tenured professor at a university in the States teaching marine biology. He loved his field so much, he became quite frustrated that others didn't love it as much as he did. He wanted to reach more people to influence them to better take care of the ocean he loved, something he struggled to do in his role at the university. So he quit his job and he moved to Hollywood. His rationale was that a lot of people wanted to watch movies, and so if he could make a movie about the plight of the ocean, then people would care more and try to save it. And he did just this. Unfortunately, though, no one watched his movies. He was a scientist communicating like a scientist, and this didn't appeal to a general public audience. He really struggled to understand why, to some people, good storytelling came really easy, whereas to him, it seemed almost a little bit out of reach. One day, Randy Olson was watching a documentary on the making of the show South Park, and Trey Parker, one of the writers, had this flyaway quote. He said, "Every time you replace an and with a but or therefore, the storytelling gets better." What they would do is write their script and then go through it to find all the ands and see if the word but or therefore would work better in that place. They called this their replacement theory. On hearing this, something for Randy Olson clicked into place. He evolved their theory a little bit further and created the ABT, and but therefore, story structure. And it looks something like this. You set the scene with statements between the word and. So there was a blue snake and a red snake. The word but introduces the contrast. The word but starts the story. It provides the tension. But someone invented the fork. You need to resolve this tension, which the word therefore can help you do. Therefore, both snakes tasted good. For those of you who have studied film, you will probably see this as an example of the 3-act structure. Randy Olson had this idea that every good movie that appeals to the masses has got that simple ABT template at its core. For example, I'll give you a high-level plot line for a movie using the ABT structure. There was once a girl, and she lived with her aunt and uncle, and her life was pretty boring. But one day a tornado swept through her home and carried her into the land of Oz. Therefore, she had to find the wizard in Emerald City to help her return home. And, but, therefore, ABT. Now, and, but, therefore are just words. There are lots of other words which can be substituted to uphold this narrative structure. And is the most common agreement word, but is a good contrasting word, and therefore provides the resolution. I teach a lot of workshops on this topic, and I found for some it's more intuitive to use the word so instead of therefore. Using and, but, therefore, or and, but, so helps to keep whatever you're writing quite conversational. You'll notice with some of these other words they can start to pick up a little bit more of a jargony feel to them. If you're still prone to forget things, even something as simple as the ABT, there was a song that came out a few years back which may help it get stuck in your head. I'm not going to sing it, but the chorus goes, "Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, but here's my number, so call me maybe." A good example of great narrative structure. So now we've talked about story structure, we can add a bit of data into it and create a data story. It really is that simple. Unfortunately, in my line of work, I see a lot of people present data in unengaging ways. I'll go to a conference or a meeting and data will be presented like this. Here's a graph of this, and here's a graph of that, and here's a graph of this. This is termed the AAA story structure, and it's non-narrative. People will pay attention long enough to get the information they're waiting for, or their mind will start to wander off, and whoever's presenting will lose their audience. A little bit of narrative structure can help improve this. Arranging data with good narrative structure will better engage an audience with it. As a side note, good narrative structure doesn't guarantee good quality data. And this is something you need to watch out for because engaging data communication is not always right. Narrative structure can be used for communicating information well, but it can also communicate disinformation and misinformation. So if you aren't sure of the data you're sharing, always run it by someone who knows a little bit more about it. Narrative structures can look quite different depending on the story you're telling. This is an example of a pretty simple data story template. It uses a few high-level statistics in order to add weight to the and statement. This one here is an example of a more detailed data story template. It uses data to support all of its narrative statements. Now we have our data story written, we can focus on how to visualize data to best communicate our story. I'm going to first give you a bit of context into the world of analytics and data visualization. This is a diagram of the analytics cycle. Now, every data insight project starts with asking a question, something you want to use data to help you find out. You then prepare the data to help you find the answer. Check it for missing values or formatting issues. When you're comfortable with the state of your data, you can explore it. Try and find those insights. You may use some kind of statistical modeling to help you do this. You may not. But any data insight is worthless unless you act on it in some way. For businesses, this could be something like a marketing campaign or a change in product design. You then evaluate your data-driven action, and the results of this would lead you to ask more questions, and then the cycle continues. This is what we call a data-driven business. As you can see, data visualization is required for most stages in this analytics cycle, as seen in the blue, but it's also required between stages, as seen in the orange. And if we look at the difference between the two, I'll explain it a little bit more. So the blue represents exploratory data visualization. This is done for the purpose of insight generation or making a data person's job easier. Because these analysts are using it as a tool to help uncover their insights, it's not associated with a data story or a message. The orange represents explanatory data visualization. This is a visualization we use when we communicate data. Because of this, its design should always be driven by a data story or a message. I'm going to focus on the orange or the explanatory visualization for the rest of this talk, just to show you how you can shift your visuals from defaults, which are usually exploratory graphs, to a data visualization that's fit for communication. There are two questions you'll need to ask yourselves. The first, what is my graph's takeaway message? What do you want people to understand when they look at your visual? If you've written your story first, deciding this will be easy. Like I said before, it's much easier to design a visual if you have a story to tell. One way you can communicate this takeaway is by using your graph's title. Now this is how I got taught to first title graphs, by basically taking the data metrics they were visualizing and putting these in the title. For example, profit over time, competitors by region, or customer complaints over time. These titles are fine if you're still analyzing your data, but they're not really suitable if you're sharing it with others. Titles on graphs designed for communication need to be far more message driven. So profit over time could become something like profit has decreased over the last 12 months. If this is what you want people to focus on when they look at your graph, this would be a good title. Other examples, competitors are more active in Auckland. Customer complaints are their highest ever. These are all examples of takeaway titles. And when designing graphs for communication, we have to be mindful that not everyone will spend time looking at the graph. Graphs aren't for everyone, regardless of how well designed they are. So if we take away our graphs, let's just say people don't look at them, at least our message will still be communicated if our titles are written this way. A good graph designed for communication is not really about how pretty you can make it look. It's about how effectively you can use it to convey your message. The second question we need to think about when designing explanatory graphs is how to highlight your takeaway message in your graph's design. This is all about how you can use contrast to make your audience look where you want them to look. To do this, I use these design techniques a lot: value, weight, size, and hue. Now, for most of you, you'll be pretty familiar with these, so I'm not going to go into detail about what they are, but I'll show you some examples of how you can apply them to a data visualization, just to give you some ideas. So value is how intense a color is compared to its background. So on a light background, the darker color will stand out more. If I asked you to tell me how many 9s, for example, are on the screen, it may take you a few seconds because there's no contrast anywhere. But if I used value to add some contrast to those 9s in particular, chances are you'd find them a lot faster because I'm using design to influence where you look. We can do the same to a graph. If my takeaway title was about the bar that I've highlighted, I know my audience will look to it first. By doing this, I'm saving them from having to make the connection themselves. Weight, this can be in regards to line or font weight. The heavier the weight, the more it's going to stand out. Same as font size. Graphs actually have a lot of text that sometimes we don't consider enough. So titles, subtitles, axis labels, data labels, annotations, footnotes. This is all text which can be communicated with a visual hierarchy, and we can do this based on font size. This is an example of how we could apply these to a line graph. Contrast using font size and weight, and line value and weight. Ideally, the graph heading would be written as a takeaway title, and this heavier line that we see in the middle there would be a way of visualizing the data to support whatever that title was telling us. This way of adding contrast using hue or color, I leave until last, purely because it's so polarizing. Everyone has different views on what colors they prefer. I'll usually design in grayscale, get feedback on the content and the layout, and when everyone's happy, I'll add the color. If your communication works in black and white, chances are that it will work with color. What you need to consider when choosing colors for any data visualization, though, is accessibility, especially when pairing together your reds and your greens. This is that previous color wheel rolled out. So the colors on the bottom line are what someone would see if they had red-green color blindness. The colors on the top line are seen by someone who doesn't. So I apologize to anyone who is colorblind because this and the next few slides may look a bit strange. 1 in 12 men are colorblind and 1 in nearly 200 women. And this is important to design for when we create our data visualizations because we're focused on communication. If someone reading it can't understand what we're trying to communicate, we've failed. So take this graph, for example. It visualizes 4 products, A, B, C, and D, and uses color to show if they are above or below a certain target. I see a lot of red and green used in graphs to show this kind of information. Businesses are in love with the idea of traffic lights to show their data metrics. Because color is the only way this graph's target information is visualized, the graph has failed for anyone who is colorblind, which is nearly 5% of the population. When we're designing graphs for data storytelling, we're in control of the message, and in turn, we're in control of how we visualize it. So how would I do this differently? It depends on what we're communicating. Are we communicating a positive message, in which case we can still use green to convey the psychology of this? Or is our message more a warning one to lift the products that are below target and highlight these using red? We wouldn't serve both of these graphs up to people. It is up to us, though, to decide which one would work best considering the message we want to communicate. Now, there are lots of tools out there to help you test your color accessibility. This one in particular enables you to plug in a whole lot of hex values and visualize complicated graphs with these colors. The tabs on the right will then enable you to see what these graphs will look like for people with different forms of colour blindness, because there are different kinds. What I find with working with organisations is their brand guidelines or brand colours don't work well for data visualization. There's either not enough colour contrast between colours, or there are accessibility issues when you pair them up. So accessibility is something important to consider when designing for communication, regardless of whether you have data involved or not. So to finish up, I thought I'd share with you an example of a data story I've designed recently. I'll talk through the narrative structure and some of the visuals I've created to help support this narrative. This is a scrolling story. I've cut it up so you can see it all on one slide, but if you want to view it close up, it's on my website, roguepenguin.co.nz. It was put together for Conservation Week and Bee Awareness Month, which fell at the same time, and looks at the relationship between honeybees and New Zealand's own native bees. So before any visuals were created here, the narrative, or that high-level ABT, was written. And this is the ABT. Around the world, bee populations are declining, and conservation efforts have increased to protect one of our more popular pollinators, the honeybee. But honeybees are not the only pollinators, and in focusing conservation efforts on them, we may have created another problem. Honeybees may be threatening New Zealand's native bees. Therefore, we need to better understand the limitations of our native flowering plants and the consequences of interactions between honeybees and native bees. Now that high-level ABT is included here in the final visual and sets the scope of my story. If I find myself trying to include data that doesn't relate to these statements, I know I'm trying to tell two different stories. And the data visuals under each of these ABT statements add weight to my story. Each graph, each illustration, each fleshed out narrative, they all relate back to the ABT statement that they sit under. This is an example of how illustration can be paired with an explanatory data visual in order to support your narrative. You'll notice the graph has a takeaway title and a clear contrast between the 2020 bar that I want people to focus on and the previous year's bars, which are there just to provide the context. Data visualization doesn't always have to come in the form of a graph, and this is where designers can excel and start to get a little bit creative. In this example, I've used mainly illustration. I've paired this with narrative and a little ruler of sorts to show the information that I wanted. It all comes down to how best you can communicate a message. And in understanding what your message is, you'll be able to design visuals in a way that best fit your audience. And that's what it's all about. So I'm going to leave you with this. Don't be scared by data. Look at it as another way to see the world. But remember, data is never the story. It just helps you support a bigger message. So it's up to you, if you choose to become a data storyteller, to figure out what that message is and to then communicate it. Thank you everyone for watching. Kia ora.
In closing, I want to again share my sincere thanks to everyone involved with Motyf 2021-2022 across our workshops, exhibition, and symposium. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your resilience. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for making this community so unique.